Okay, in part 2 of our paced rhythms, we're going to start looking at the basic functions of pacemakers. There is firing, capturing, and sensing. And what we mean by firing is when the pulse generator, so that pulse generator is the part that's embedded underneath in the chest. It's got that battery in it. It is going to, when it fires, it is going to deliver a preset amount of electrical stimulus to the heart. So it's going to set amount of electricity that's going to come down this wire and stimulate the myocardial cells and actually start stimulating the heart to fire. So this preset amount of energy is determined by what the patient needs, how sensitive their tissues are, but the doctor always tests it when they're actually putting the pacemaker in. And so when you see fire happen, you're going to actually see a spike on the ECG paper. That's what's going to let you know that the pulse generator actually fired and sent that impulse down. So then we have to capture. And so what we mean by capturing is the heart has to respond to that stimulus. It has to depolarize. Now, if we think about this, if we have a wire that's embedded into the heart and it's embedded into the myocardial cells down here in the ventricles, for instance, when the pulse generator fires, that's what's going to give us these pacemaker spikes here on our ECG paper. So we're going to see a spike when the machine fires. When capture happens, it's going to depolarize the heart. But instead of coming from the SA node and going through the intranodal and intraatrial pathways down the right and left bundle branches to depolarize the ventricles normally, what this is going to do is it's going to fire into the myocardial cells and it's going to depolarize through cell-to-cell conduction. Now that's going to take longer. So that's going to give us on our ECG paper, it's going to give us kind of a wide and bizarre QRS. So when it's depolarizing, what we will see for firing, we're going to see this pacemaker spike, and if it captures, that means the ventricles have depolarized, but because it's done it through cell-to-cell conduction, it's going to take longer, it's going to be wider because it takes longer, and it's going to be a little bit rougher, a little bit more bizarre. It's going to look more like a PVC type of look to it. But that's how we know capture has happened due to that firing. So ventricular paced rhythm, I got my ventricular spike, wide funky QRS. Pacemaker spike for firing, capture showing me on my wide QRS. Now, if it's an atrial pacemaker, I would see a pacemaker spike before the P wave, and then the P wave, when the atria depolarize, the atria is going to be looking like an abnormal P wave, because instead of coming from the SA node and going through the intranodal and intraatrial pathways normally, it's going to be embedded into the muscle here of the atria, and it's going to get through the atria through cell-to-cell conduction. So our P wave is going to become atypical or an abnormal P wave. So what I'm seeing here on this one here, I see a pacemaker spike and an abnormal P wave. My P wave's going upside down. And then a normal QRS, meaning their own ventricles are kicking in. Here again, I see a pacemaker spike, abnormal P wave. This is their own QRS complex. And I see it again here and here. Now their own P wave kicked in. So their own P wave fired. And so the pacemaker saw that, and it inhibited the pacemaker from firing, didn't let it fire so the person's own beat could kick in, their own QRS, and this is their own beat again. And then when their own P wave didn't fire again, then the pacemaker fired for it. So this is capturing, and it's working correctly. Now, the other thing we want the pacemaker to do is to be able to sense the person's underlying rhythm. So the pulse generator needs to be able to see the person's own intrinsic beat, their own heartbeat, so it won't fire on it, or so it will stop the pacemaker from firing at that time. So here, if I look at this one, I see a big pacemaker spike, so that's showing me firing has happened. Capture, this one's in the ventricles. I can see this big funky QRS. Okay, so my pacemaker fired and it captured. Here it fired again and it captured. But now it sensed the person's own rhythm. Their own QRS came into it. So because it sensed the person's own rhythm correctly, it waits, it doesn't fire during that time frame, and now it waits a certain amount of time after that because it's going to give your own heart rate a chance to fire back in. If it doesn't, then the pacemaker is going to fire again and your QRS is going to go again. So it has the ability to see the person's underlying rhythm. Now, there are a couple interval measurements we need to learn with pacemakers, and one of them is the automatic interval. This is the amount of time occurring between the paced beats when the pulse generator is firing continuously. So what that means is, let's say my pacemaker is set at a rate of 70. I should see a pacemaker spike, and then that's because it's fired. The wide QRS is letting me know it captured. Fired, captured. Okay, so this is a completely paced rhythm. This is only a ventricular paced rhythm. If I told you this was a DDD pacemaker, we would know it wouldn't be working correctly, because if it was a DDD, it would be pacing both atria and ventricles. This is only pacing the ventricles, so this is probably a VVI pacemaker. But what happens is, once it goes into a paced rhythm, if it's set at a rate of 70, the automatic interval will fire. So it fires at the same interval. So R to R to R is going to be very, very regular with a paced rhythm, and it's going to automatically fire at that rate of 70. So it's the time occurring between the paced beats where the pulse generator is firing continuously. Now, you also have an escape interval measurement with pacemakers, which can be just a little bit more confusing. It's the amount of time that the pacemaker waits after their own beat before firing. So what I mean by that is, let's look at our patient's underlying rhythm here. It is irregular, so QRS to QRS to QRS is irregular, and I don't have clear, distinct P waves. It looks like my underlying rhythm is a atrial fib, because I have an irregular R to R and no clear, distinct P waves. Now the atrial fib, here their QRS fires, and it's not firing. The pacemaker, so let's say the pacemaker is set to fire at a rate of 70. Here's where it should have fired if it wanted to go at a rate of 70. But what I mean by an escape interval is, it's going to wait just a little bit longer for that first beat to allow their own QRS to fire. If it doesn't, now it's going to do a pacemaker spike, wide funky QRS, pacemaker spike, wide funky QRS, and now it will go at that automatic interval at a rate of 70. But the first beat after the person's own intrinsic beat, it gives it just a little extra time lag, because it's going to try to let it give the person's own heart rate a chance to kick in, so the pacemaker doesn't have to be used as much. So escape interval, that extra little time lag before it goes into that rate of 70. Automatic interval, now it would just start firing at a rate of 70. But now their own QRS kicked back in, and it went back into their own rhythm. So the nice thing with pacemakers is they don't have to be firing continuously. They can be firing intermittently, depending on what the person's own heart rhythm is. If their own heart rate is at a nice normal rate, we're going to let their own heart rate do it. If it can't, if it goes below a certain level, then that pacemaker will kick in for you. So a VVI pacemaker means it's going to pace the ventricles, it's going to sense what their own ventricular rate is doing, and it's going to inhibit itself by what it sees. So here, it looks like the person's own P wave is there, but nothing happened after it. So the pacemaker fired, so I have fire, and I have capture, my big wide QRS. Now their own P wave and their own QRS kicked in, so the pacemaker senses that and inhibits itself from firing because of it. Now their own P wave fires again, but their QRS didn't kick in. So the pacemaker realizes that, fires. So I have fires and a wide funky QRS. Their own P wave went, but the QRS didn't follow it, so the pacemaker fired. So this pacemaker is only worried about what the ventricles are doing. It's not really paying attention to what the P waves are doing. It's only paying attention to the person's own underlying ventricular rate. Where a DDD pacemaker, we said, has two wires, one in the atria, one in the ventricles. It is going to pace both the atria and the ventricles, and it will inhibit itself or trigger itself depending on what it's seeing. So DDD pacemakers are kind of interesting to look at. So when I look here, I have the person's own P wave and their own QRS. So the pacemaker didn't fire. Now it's weighted, it's supposed to fire at a rate of 70, and it doesn't fire. It gives it a little bit longer escape interval, and boom, it's not fired. So now the pacemaker fires for their P wave, and I get an upside down P wave. And it doesn't have to be upside down, it'll just look different than their normal P wave. and then a pacemaker spike and a wide funky QRS. So it paced for the atria, it paced for the ventricles. Now the pacemaker went to fire again because their own P wave didn't kick in, so the pacemaker fired and I got a funky P wave, but their own QRS kicked in. So the ventricles saw that their own QRS responded to that paced P wave and it inhibited itself. So this is still working correctly, okay? So now it's only pacing the atria, their own ventricles kicked in, the pacemaker inhibited itself from the ventricles. Now their own P wave kicked in, so the atria part didn't fire because it saw that and it inhibited itself, but the ventricles didn't respond to it, so it triggered the pacemaker, the ventricles, to fire again and pace the ventricles. So, and here their own P wave, their own QRS came in. So DDD pacemakers are really kind of cool to look at because you can have their own P wave, own QRS. You can have a paced P wave, paced QRS. You can have a paced P wave, their own QRS, or their own P wave and a paced QRS. So, and all of that is accurate depending on what their underlying rate is doing. So here's another example of a DDD pacemaker. I have a pacemaker spike and an abnormal P wave because the pacemaker fired for it, pacemaker spike and a wide funky QRS. And that looks like their T wave. Then I have a paced abnormal P wave, paced abnormal QRS. So this is both paced atrially and paced ventricularly. Then their own P wave kicked in and their own QRS, so the pacemaker inhibited both. Their own P wave and own QRS kicked in, so the pacemaker inhibited itself. Now their own P wave fired, but it didn't send the impulse down to the ventricles on time, so the pacemaker fired for the ventricles, gave us a wide QRS. Here their own P wave kicked in, pacemaker fired, wide QRS, and here I have a pacemaker spike, abnormal P wave, pacemaker spike, ventricle. So this pacemaker is working correctly. Okay. So here's another paced rhythm here. This one would be a VVI pacemaker. I have a pacemaker spike, wide funky QRS, pacemaker spike, wide funky QRS, pacemaker spike, wide funky QRS. And this is an automatic interval. So for once it gets going, it's going to fire at an automatic interval if it's continually firing. Okay, so this would be a ventricular paced rhythm at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, probably at a rate of 70. Most of them are set at 70. Now this one here, it looks like I have their own P wave QRS, their own P wave QRS, their own P wave QRS, their own P wave, but the ventricles didn't kick in, so I've got a pacemaker spike and a wide funky QRS. Their own P wave, but the QRS didn't kick in, so pacemaker spike, wide funky QRS, their own P wave, pacemaker spike, wide funky QRS. So this can actually, even though I've only seen it pace the ventricles, this is still, if I know they have a DDD pacemaker, that's still working correctly. On a 12-lead ECG, you can see that our QRSs will look different depending on what lead you're in. We said usually we monitor in lead 2, so here's a little clip of lead 2 where we see a little pacemaker spike and a wide funky QRS. Here's V1, which is equivalent to 12-lead, or to MCL1. And you're going to notice that in some leads, the pacemaker spikes are easier to see than in others. Okay, so in some leads, the pacemaker spikes are easier to look at. So sometimes you may need to monitor them in a different lead to be able to really truly see that pacemaker spike. Here is a dual paced rhythm. So I have a pacemaker spike, and it's kind of a flattened P wave here. This is looking at it in lead 2. This is looking at it in MCL. So in MCL, I can see my P wave a little bit better. It looks pretty flattened out here, but I see my pacemaker spike and a flattened P wave, pacemaker spike and a QRS, pacemaker spike and a flattened P wave, pacemaker spike and a QRS. So this would be a dual chamber or a DDD pacemaker that's pacing both atria and the ventricles. So we're going to go ahead and stop here, and we'll continue in the next section.